So far, there are two scenarios for you. You either followed the previous section or you didn't. If you didn't, you probably already forked this repository in here. And if you did, you probably already have the repository yourself on your own GitHub account. Now, if you didn't follow the previous section, here is what you want to do to make sure that you are ready to start exactly where we left off in the previous section. Because if you forked this repository, you will already see a lot of commits and all of the branches that we will create throughout the rest of the course. Because of course, this is the repository to which I will add all of that code. So if you forked that repository, I want you to do one of two things. The first one is to go to the resources of this lecture and download the zip file. That zip file contains the code where we left off in the previous section. That version of the code is the one that you should upload to your own repository. That is one of the options. The other option is for you to go to that fork of this repository, go over to the commits, and find the add event properties commit from July 16th. This is the last commit that I made in the previous section, so this is going to be exactly the same as the code that you can download from the resources. If you come to this commit and click on this button here to the right, you will be able to browse this repository at this point in time. You will have to work with this version. So either way, you should be able to see exactly the same thing that we're seeing here. The same code that we are eventually going to be using throughout this section to enable CI. Now, if you did follow the previous section, you may not have all of the code yet on GitHub. So just make sure that you do. Go over to the terminal, go over to the repository, the local repository that you have, and execute git status. You may have some untracked files, some pending changes that you haven't committed yet. Just make sure that you commit them and that you push them over to the remote repository that we set up previously. If I execute git log, for example, I not only see the first two commits that we made in the previous section, of course the initial commit and the startup center commit, but I also created an additional commit for each of the lectures. So that was me, but you can just have one additional commit to these ones, the ones that we did create in the previous section. At the end though, we should all have the exact same source code somewhere on GitHub. You should have created your own repository and have the code here, either because you followed the previous section or because you have just uploaded everything to that repository from the zip file that you downloaded, either from the resources of this lecture here on Udemy or from the forked repository. Now it is time for us to create the branches. Now, I know that we haven't been following our own advice so far and we have everything on master. So far, that is not such a big deal because we haven't implemented any CI/CD flow just yet, and because our application so far is just the beginning of the entire process. It is just a bare bones application. So, what we have to do is set up those two new branches, and I will show you exactly what process we're going to be following throughout the rest of this section. I will start by creating the test branch. So here directly from GitHub, it's okay if I don't do this through the terminal. I am going to be creating the test branch. And you can see how it is going to be creating the test branch from master. That is exactly what we want. We want test branch to have everything that master already has. So I will simply click on this button. And there we go. The test branch has been created. And it is even with master. Both branches contain exactly the same commits. Now I am going to navigate back to master. And I am going to be creating the dev branch. And again, because I navigated back to master, this branch is going to be created from master. In this case, it doesn't make too much of a difference if we create it from master or from test, because both contain the exact same commits. But this is what I'm going to do. I will create dev from master. And there we have it. We have all 3 branches ready. But so far, we only have these branches on the remote. We don't have them locally. So what I will do is actually navigate over to Visual Studio. We're going to be doing this now from Visual Studio to show exactly how we can work with branches from here. From Visual Studio, I of course have my application open. I can go over to version control and select Manage Branches and Remotes. All of this is of course coming from the Git repository that we have set and that we can access from the terminal. So this is exactly the same, and behind the scenes it is going to be executing Git commands. We are just going to have this user interface through the IDE. And from here we can of course see the master branch that we have been working with, but if we navigate over to remote sources, we see origin. And if we extend origin, we see master and test. Perhaps you already see test. If you don't, you only need to execute fetch. And you should already see all of the branches available on the remote. This fetch is essentially checking for changes on the remote. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but so far we now see the 3 branches. What I will do is select one of the branches that is not master, for example test, and over here select to track in a local branch. I am going to name this local branch test, and it is going to track that remote test. This track essentially means to set the upstream, just like we do when pushing with a -u over to a remote. This is going to make test the default branch to which we are going to be pushing from the local test branch. So we'll click on OK. And I will do exactly the same thing with dev. I want to track this on a local dev branch. So I will click on OK. This means that now over on branches, I see 3 branches: the dev, the test, and the master. I want to switch over to dev because most of the times we're going to be working with dev. We don't want to commit into test. We don't want to commit into master. We want to commit into dev. So I will switch to that branch. And we can see that that one turns to be selected. We can close this. And over here to the left or to the right, if you're on Windows, on the Solution Explorer, we will now be able to see that dev is indeed the selected branch. So we now have the 3 branches locally as well. The last thing that I want to show you in this lecture is the process that we will follow to execute a continuous integration process that we will enable in the next lecture. So essentially everything is going to begin here on the IDE. Let's say that I want to change how this login button in the login page is presented. So far, you may remember, if you follow the previous section, this button is using the entire available space in this page because it has just no limits in here other than the content page itself. So what I will do is simply wrap this button in a stack layout. So inside of the stack layout, it is now going to be using only the space that it needs. And I can confirm that by opening the preview. So I will split this and we see that the login is now on top. If I didn't have the stack layout, it is going to be in the middle using the entire available space. So with the stack layout, it is now on top. Let me actually set the vertical options to be center for the stack layout. So the button is at the center, but now it is not using the entire available space. If I were to set a background, any background, we see that the button is just using this necessary amount of space. Again, without the stack layout, it would use all of the page. So this small change, this small feature is the one that I want to commit. What I want to do is to commit it on a feature branch. Now, normally I would create that feature branch before. Right here, I've been working on dev, but since I haven't tracked anything, I can actually just come here over to the terminal and execute git checkout -b, and let's say that this is feature 1. And now I have switched to feature 1. And we can confirm that by navigating over to Visual Studio, and over here to the left on the solution, I see feature 1 in parentheses. I am indeed now working on this new branch. So this is what we will usually do. We will create a new feature branch where we're going to be coding everything that is required, making all of the required commits. So for example, right now that I have this change that is part of this feature, I can execute git commit -am and set this to be center login button. And this is now part only of the feature 1 branch. This is what you want. You want this feature to be isolated in one feature branch, not on one of the main branches. Eventually, of course, you will merge into the dev branch. But we want this mostly to happen from the remote. So most of the times we are not going to be merging from here, from the terminal, from the local repository. What you want as soon as your feature branch is ready is to push over to that remote. So I will push feature 1 over to origin. This is what you want. As soon as the feature branch is ready, push it over to the remote. And it is over on the remote where we're going to see that new feature. And we want to create a pull request for this feature to be merged into dev. Dev is, at least most of the times, the branch into which we will merge those feature branches. So I will simply go ahead and create this pull request, and at this point, eventually, it is where a continuous integration process should begin. That is exactly what we're going to take a look at in the next lecture. So far, we see no continuous integration process being executed. But this right here, this pull request, as I've mentioned before, is going to be a cornerstone of the continuous integration process. So let me just close this pull request because we're not really going to be using it just yet. I didn't merge anything, so dev is still not containing whatever is on feature. We can actually navigate over to branches to see that the feature branch is ahead, one commit ahead of all other branches. That is what we're going to take a look at in the next lecture, in which we're going to be connecting our repository to our App Center applications.